Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Science Facts and Fallacies, episode 207. Joined as always by Dr. Kevin Folta. My name is Cameron English. I'm your host. Kevin, so good to see you. Right on cue. There's our animal friends chiming in. How's it going, man?
It's very interesting times. The one thing that I would really like to talk about is yesterday I had the opportunity to give a presentation at something called uh, ComSciCon, which is a science communication event that is originated by graduate students, and they invite the speakers from graduate students, and had a wonderful, wonderful time. And they were so good. Their questions were spot on. They did these minute talks that were just off the cuff, and they didn't know they were going to do them. And so many of them were so amazing. So just really, it shows that our big push towards recommending science communication at least has the next generation of bright students thinking about it. And it just was so natural for them. It wasn't like, well, I don't have to do this. I'm a scientist. They understand this is part of their mission, and I absolutely love it. So good stuff.
Awesome, man. I always love to hear that Kevin's out there spreading the good news about science communication and getting more people to do it. That's the other thing. There's some people, they're good at it, but their thing is being good at it. Whereas you're like, I'm pretty good at this. Now let me show you how to do it. And, the world's a little bit of a better place as a result of that. So thanks as always.
The funny part about this is that there were two other people on the panel, and I don't know that they're full-time jobs. One of them seemed to be more involved in science communication, one more in an outreach position, and just a different way in which you approach it. Like for me, it's all about communication. It's all about how we communicate, how people think, how people receive information. I dwell on those concepts rather than the concepts that scientists normally go on, which are like, well, avoid jargon and speak clearly, which tends to be a little bit more how others do it. So I think it is much more just basic communication, and that's how we talk about it.
Yeah. Good stuff, man. All right. Well, let's jump into our stories for this week. We have 3 as always. And these are interesting, Kevin, because they're very practical. And sometimes the stuff we talk about, it's more on the farm or it's more in the lab, and it's sort of removed from everyday life. But I think the stuff is all going to hit.
Wow!
And apparently your animals agree. This is gonna hit close to home. So, so first up, is chocolate good for you? Claims that dark chocolate can lower heart disease is very common these days, but the FDA says these claims need a second look. Next up, do we have a cure for binge drinking? There's a new pill coming that could help people consume less alcohol. Interesting. And finally, gene-edited wheat significantly lowers cancer-linked acrylamide, which forms when bread is baked or toasted. Intriguing stuff, Kevin. Okay, first up, I've been hearing this as long as I've been alive, it seems. Dark chocolate improves this or that, particularly heart disease. So what's going on here?
Well, I think what this boils down to is the fact that cocoa, the raw material which goes into chocolate, it has some potential health benefits. And things like antioxidants, so it's full of different antioxidants, polyphenols, other minerals like magnesium and zinc and copper, and all kinds of other goodies that are in there. And over the years, there's been a push that since chocolate has all of these micronutrients that have some putative health benefits, maybe chocolate is good for you. And people who've tried to do these studies have had kind of mixed results. Most of the time, things that are suggestive but not statistically significant. And if you go back through the data, there's quite a few. They're either suggestive and say, well, maybe a slight effect, or no real effect. So that's been the preponderance of the data. And in 2018, there's a Swiss chocolate company that's called Barry Callebaut. And Barry Callebaut wrote to the FDA and said, we want to put some health claims on our chocolate. Because some of the studies that we looked at endpoints like cholesterol and HDL and LDL and blood pressure and other types of endpoints which would indicate some sort of health benefit. But the FDA said, you know what, let's put the brakes on this. We don't really have enough definitive data. And that, as I mentioned, it really is just suggestive.
So one thing that seems like an obvious issue is that chocolate is often paired with a boatload of sugar And I'm wondering, does that offset the benefit? You know what I mean? So I'm sure there's all kinds of considerations the FDA went through, and they're probably pretty typical of what we talk about when we look at epidemiology. These are tenuous associations, or maybe, there's a trend towards statistical significance, something like that. So what exactly are they looking at as an agency when they develop their skepticism of these kind of health claims?
Well, I think when you have a health claim, you have to show profound evidence that shows the definitive link. And that's a big difference between suggestive effects. So suggestive effects are like when you see data that sometimes indicate maybe a slight effect in that direction, or that there are potentially confounding variables that would limit the effect from being seen. So let's just flip this the other way. When we talk about glyphosate, you see little suggestive effects here and there. Certain studies show slight increases in certain cancers. Other ones don't show it at all. Other ones show suggestive trends and that's what IARC made their decision on with glyphosate. So you can't say definitively based upon these data. Plus other confounding variables in chocolate, like you mentioned. You're raising the amount of fat in the diet. You're raising the amount of glucose. You're raising the amount of sugar, because sugar is usually a big part of chocolate. And this is also just dark chocolate, right? This is cocoa, not even dark chocolate. This is just the cocoa powder itself. When you start complexing this with milk and sugar, you significantly decrease the amount of active potential ingredients. And so it would be one of these deals where you'd have to eat so many hundreds of chocolate bars in order to see any kind of health benefit. And you'd have to use something like the 70% cocoa chocolate bars, which in my mind don't taste so hot. So that's the other big caveat.
Yeah, I think I said once that you'd have to eat so much that your type 2 diabetes would give your diabetes in order to improve your heart health. So, I can be critical of the FDA, but it seems like this is probably a reasonable take here. And it seems like the kind of thing they wouldn't really look at unless someone comes to them and says, hey, can we make this claim in our marketing materials? So this is good. I think sometimes these agencies can be overly skeptical and overly conservative, because if something goes wrong, if they approve a drug or something, or they miss something, then everybody jumps up their butt. Every media outlet, every activist group, there's a risk of lawsuits. So sometimes they get it wrong because of that, but it seems here that they've probably made the correct call and just sided with the evidence. What do you think on that before we move on?
Well, I think that's correct. You're just taking a more conservative approach, as the FDA tends to do, and we've always known that about the FDA. They're asking to make a health claim, and there's just not data to support a health claim. And that to have such data, you would need a rigorous clinical trial, just like you do for a drug. If you're going to make a health claim about it, you have to be able to demonstrate that there's dose and response, and that there's safe levels and thresholds that you must consume in order to obtain the health claim. So there's a lot more to it. It would take a lot of people and a lot of time, and a placebo group that would have to eat, milk chocolate, versus a control group or a treatment group, which would get dark chocolate. So it would be a really challenging study, and other confounding variables in the diet. I think it would be very difficult. Let's just say the effect of cocoa powder is not profound enough to be able to demonstrate this outside of a massive clinical trial that may end up showing marginal differences.
Right. And no one's going to want to pay for that, which is why Mars and all these companies, they fund all of these longitudinal studies that don't really prove anything. One thing I just want to mention in passing, I interviewed Dr. Henry Miller a couple weeks back for another show that I do. And he used to be at the FDA, as we've mentioned here before. And one point that he made is that in Europe and some of these other countries, the government hires independent scientists as contractors. So they don't directly work for the regulatory agency. And they are paid to approve a new drug. And there's specific standards that have to be met. And as a result of that, you get more even-handed decisions. So I wonder over time, and we don't have to dwell on this, if that could improve the way the FDA does things, So maybe we'd get more decisions like this from the FDA if you had people there who were just paid to do a particular thing instead of having to worry about the political fallout of whatever their decision is. I just think that might be an interesting approach, but we probably won't see that here. So we'll have to see. Okay. So moving on, Kevin, do we have a cure for binge drinking, or is this headline a little overblown?
Well, it goes back to the idea that is kind of well established. And in a way, this isn't terribly new news. It talks about the drug naltrexone, and naltrexone has the ability to work with receptors in the brain to limit alcohol effects or opioid effects, or at least cravings of alcohol or opioids. And that's what's really cool about this particular drug. It binds to specific receptors in the brain and limits the cravings for alcohol. And this is by working against endorphins. So this is a really interesting approach. And there's been some studies done over time where people who have, if they take this drug when they either are planning binge drinking or potentially or not, even planning it, it can limit the cravings of turning a drinking event into a binge drinking event, or can limit the cravings of alcohol at all. It only works in some people, doesn't work at all the time for everybody. So that's the major driver. And we forgot to mention the original article was at WebMD, and this was written by Jay Croft. What they define binge drinking as 4 or more drinks in one sitting. And so that's why you want to get up after the third, go somewhere else and have the fourth, right? No, it's a 4 more in one sitting. And so the whole idea of this particular report analyzed a relatively small cohort of men and tested how they would respond to this particular drug and how that would curb their cravings. And it seemed to have a positive effect.
I see. So the overarching goal seems to be stop people from drinking too much in one sitting so they don't jump off a roof into their swimming pool or or get behind the wheel of a car. I imagine this is the goal behind this. Is that what they're looking to do? Because I mean, unless you drink a ton and you develop alcohol poisoning or something, binge drinking isn't bad in one sitting necessarily. It's that chronic drinking, like the college student for all 4 years or longer. If every Friday night, they're going out to the bar and they're just slamming beer after beer, that can be very, very serious for your health chronically.
Right. So alcohol use disorder and other types of addictive side of alcohol, the dependency side of alcohol, I should say, that is pharmacological, and that's something that naltrexone can inhibit. So what it does is it limits that craving to keep going, or the folks who, I know people who, once they start, they can't stop, right? They're fine until they have the first one, and then they keep going until they pass out or, end of the day or whatever. And that's the kind of thing that this apparently can inhibit. So it may not even curb the desire for that first one, but maybe it will. They're just different in different people. And I've heard about this before. This has been something that's been well established.
So I'm wondering how it would be utilized. Would it just be sort of a population level recommendation to people that you take a pill like this just to sort of moderate your desire for alcohol, or would you identify specific populations that are maybe prone to binge drinking, like I mentioned, college students, or maybe people with histories of mental health disorders and so forth? This is the part of this that's really fascinating to me is how you deploy something like this, even if you can truly show that the effect is powerful in a study like the one they did.
Well, to me, it would be first in line for people who are treating those with alcohol dependencies and alcohol use issues. So people who maybe are getting pulled over for too many DUIs, who are court assigned for medical care to break the dependence, or people who, because they're showing up drunk at work, are sent to alcohol recovery, or other folks who have maybe don't want to wrestle with AA and all of the weird spirituality edges of that thing, and sitting on a folding chair in a church basement, having people, having other folks with similar issues point fingers at you. Maybe that's part of it too. But at least it allows another tool for physicians to be able to prescribe something that works. And I think this it's been prescribed for quite a while. So I'm not sure exactly that's not the new part about this study. What the new part about the study is the study itself in American Journal of Psychiatry that showed that over 12 weeks that it does work. That when you provide this drug plus some counseling, it does help to curb alcohol intake. So it's a really important part of the study.
Interesting. Yeah. So it's almost like behavioral cognitive therapy, it sounds like, like you go see a therapist and then maybe they'll prescribe you an antidepressant. And then you have sort of a 1-2 punch against whatever you're struggling with. Or maybe it's like, you crashed your car into a telephone pole. And so, you have to get the breathalyzer on your steering wheel and you have to take this drug or something like that. I don't know. There's probably some legal complications there, but it seems like there's some interesting ways for this to be utilized to help people.
Well, it's just another tool in the toolbox. And I think it doesn't work the same on all people. It's been used in other types of applications with opioids and certainly with opioids. And I believe even with behaviors like gambling and sex addiction, that this breaks an endorphin-based loop in the brain that continues to crave more satisfaction from whatever it was that it was receiving from. And don't quote me on the sex addiction part, but I think it was the a friend told me. No, I think it was. I believe gambling was spot on with this. It's a drug that seems to break that cycle, and so a really useful tool in the toolbox because it's a relatively cheap and innocuous drug, and it's well established. Its use has been very well shown. It's been shown to be safe and effective. It doesn't work at all in other people. So it's one of these things that your chemistry, your brain, then there's other things that they can prescribe. I don't remember the other one they typically prescribe, but the nice thing about naltrexone is you take it once a day and or maybe twice a day, whatever it is, and it lasts for some time. The other major therapy, the name escapes me, but it's one of these things you need to take multiple times a day, like every 6 hours or something. So it's one of these less likely to have adherence and compliance with taking the drug, and that's why it fails. So both are effective. There's multiple ways to help with this problem, mostly in the interest of staving off long-term impacts of chronic alcohol abuse.
Yeah. Yeah. Could you imagine the drug commercial for this? If they start deploying it, it'd be like, my homepage is Pornhub and I just can't stop going there. Ask your doctor if naltrexone is right for you.
Side effects may be.
General and unhappiness and malaise. Okay. All right, we're done. We're done.
Parts of your body turning blue.
Yeah. All right. I couldn't help it. I had to make a sex joke. What do you want from me? It's my show. I do what I want. Okay. Okay. This is another one I've heard a lot about. Kevin,
Science Facts and Fallacies.
Yeah. See, we just feed off each other. It's a negative feedback loop. Okay. So gene editing, Kevin, I've heard a lot about this too over the years. There's a couple of different teams working on this, but explain what acrylamide is and why it's, I guess, potentially harmful and why they're trying to reduce it in bread.
Yeah, so the article came from the Times UK. Adam Vaughan, Gene Editing Wheat, How It Lowers the Cancer-Linked Acrylamide, which forms when bread is baked and toasted. So this acrylamide is a compound that we use in the lab all the time. And acrylamide is a neurotoxin. It is a carcinogen. It has been described by the IARC as a known carcinogen. And where does acrylamide come from? Well, acrylamide occurs when the amino acid asparagine is heated under high temperatures complex with sugars. And so this is what happens when we cook certain kinds of food that's high in asparagine. The most notable one is frying potatoes. If you fry potatoes and there's asparagine, which there is amino acid, it's in every protein, but a free amino acid is affected by the heat where it creates acrylamide. You also see this in bread when you toast it. It's in your coffee. It's in any time you take a food item that's high in asparagine and then raise the temperature. And the high temperature of frying probably is the worst. French fries are probably the worst for this. potato chips, things like that are probably the biggest culprit probably the biggest culprit with respect to acrylamide formation. And formation is one of these things that acrylamide is one of these IARC known carcinogens, right? So how do you get around this? Well, if it's formed by the induction of or by changes to an amino acid, what if you could get rid of that amino acid or at least significantly decrease its abundance in a given tissue? And so scientists have gone through now a couple of different plants, namely the potato was first. Simplot did this a while ago. And then now wheat has been done at Rothamsted Research in the UK, where they've used gene editing to decrease the abundance of a gene or decrease the activity of an enzyme, which is encoded by the gene asparagine synthase. And when you cut down the amount of asparagine synthase, which this particular gene variant is expressed highly in the kernel itself, when you decrease that amount of asparagine, you decrease significantly the amount of acrylamide that's formed. So really cool experiments, and looks like it works like a charm.
So that's good news overall. I suppose my question, as it often is how serious of a problem is this? Because everybody eats fried foods. Everyone eats toast, or most people, I should say. So I'm wondering, like, how big of a risk this is. Is this really contributing to cancer rates here or in the UK or elsewhere? You know what I mean? In other words, is this just a cool kind of proof of concept application they're developing, or is this really going to benefit public health in some significant way?
It's hard to say. I mean, I think that people I've heard speak on this who speak about risk say that the risk is extremely small, but it is an added risk and significantly more than some of the other things that people worry about. Again, like glyphosate. This is not even in the same ballpark. The funny part about this is that there is some interesting political overlays to the discussion about acrylamide, because Proposition 65 in California certainly would say that everything that's fried should bear the label could be a carcinogen in California, or has been suspected to cause cancer in California. And so Proposition 65 with Starbucks fought this like crazy because they wanted to put a warning on coffee places, which would have been appropriate and completely in line with what Proposition 65 does. And but that means every loaf of bread, every cup of coffee, French fries, and potato chips. And so the risk is extremely small, and yet it is a legitimate risk. So it's one of these places where there's a gray area with how we speak about it as scientists and how we speak about it as science communicators. Keep drinking your coffee, enjoy your chips and fries, and have a nice piece of toast. Don't sweat it, but there is risk there.
Yeah. Excuse me. It's so funny. I think living in California causes cancer because we have so many stupid laws that you have to sift through to know if they actually do anything useful. And Prop 65 is a great example. A couple weeks ago, when I wasn't here for the show, I was on vacation, and my wife and I are in an Italian restaurant, and they have a Prop 65 warning that says, food served in this establishment contain chemicals known to the state of California to cause cancer, blah, 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 or to be linked to cancer, whatever the exact wording is. And they're talking about the garlic bread that we're eating. They're talking about acrylamide. And of course, while we're eating dinner, we're drinking a bottle of red wine, which no one denies is a carcinogen. It's just so funny to me. There's all these goofy nuances to these laws. And I've heard it before that the problem may be that you warn people that everything causes cancer, and then they just tune out any warning that you give them. So I don't know. I guess on the technology side, this is cool that you can edit the genome of wheat in this way. So I don't know. Is there anything else people should know about this? Like a future application of this that might be even more helpful?
I don't really know, other than this is another success of gene editing and another way in which we can use issues of finesse to be able to affect traits that could have a positive health impact. And the funny part is that people like, your Jeffrey Smiths and other folks would say, the production of gene editing is the dangerous part. This is a great example where gene editing and safely mutating a single base or two to change that gene product really makes it more safe. And so
Right.
this is, there's no doubt here. This actually does make it more safe. So if anything, it's a nice thing that advocates for technology can use to further erode the arguments that genetic engineering is a dangerous science.
Yeah, that's right. The ballroom dancer turned biotechnology expert, Jeffrey Smith. He said some goofy things, man. I know you've heard it all, but he said something about, eating GMO soy causing cancer in your stomach or something, like really goofy things. And it wasn't you. I think it was, I don't know. There was another expert. She was in that biotech documentary that you watched 1,300 times. Food evolution, right? That was the one. And she's like, yeah, I don't know where he got that idea about GMOs causing cancer, but he just kind of pulls stuff out of his.
Okay, yeah. No, 100%. He's unbelievable. And the funny part was, it was a couple of years ago that, like, in 2013, I was supposed to debate him, and he was fine with it, and he was going to debate John Entine. And then he was going to debate John Entine at Cato Center. And then he said, well, I want to have on my side Gilles-Eric Seralini. And John's like, okay, that's perfectly fine. But then I get Kevin Folta. And so totally cool. We're going to do this. And then Seralini and Smith ended up pulling out. But, and then later, I think it was about 2 years ago, I got an email from Jeffrey Smith's people. And they said, he wants to be on your podcast. And I'm like, by all means, let's do it. It would be wonderful. And I'm down with it. I said, I'm all good. This is great. I mean, is he going to come clean? Is he going to, what is this about? I was so excited that he was going to come on. And then at the last minute, they wrote and said, Jeffrey will not be joining you on the podcast. I mean, I think that someone must have got fired that day.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think they had a form letter for trying to get him some press, and then they saw your podcast and like, oh, that would be great. And then they took it to him, probably spit his coffee out and said, no, that's that'd be a bad fit for us here at the Institute of Responsible, blah, whatever his basement is called these days.
the Institute for Responsible Technology.
That's right.
And brooms and dustpans. It's a little dust closet that's unbelievable. But the funny part is I even got into an argument on Twitter this week about him, where someone said he is the expert. And, oh God,
yeah,
the king of non-experts.
There's no such thing. He's good at stirring up dust. And I've talked to you, and I've talked to a few other people about claims he's made about genetically engineered potatoes. And when you actually go and talk to like a toxicologist, they go, yeah, this guy is so utterly up his own butt. There's just no, and they don't put it that way. That's my paraphrase, but whether it's gene edited wheat or GMO potatoes or, whatever. Anyways, okay, we're done. I just want to take a few minutes to slap Jeffrey Smith on the forehead because it's always fun. Thank you, as always, to everyone for joining us. We'll be back next week for episode 208. You can follow us on social media. It's at Kevin Folta on Twitter, at ACSH.org for my writing. And, of course, follow Genetic Literacy Project because they put this whole thing on. They're just at Genetic Literacy. Kevin, as always, it's been a pleasure. I hope you have a somewhat restful next couple days. Maybe not.
It ain't going to happen.
All right. Well, the rest of you have a pleasant whatever time it is that you're listening to this podcast. We'll see you next week.